could have you start by just saying your name and then spelling your last name?
My name is Richard E. Johanson. The last name is spelled Johanson.
Thank you. My name is Laura Arata. It is March 5th, 2014, and we're conducting this interview on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. So Richard, I would like to start out if you could just tell us a little bit about how you came to Hanford and where you came from.
Well, my folks moved to Benton County. Actually, it was Prosser in about 1930 when I was about 3 years old. And a year later, we moved to Benton City, where they resided ever since that time. And went to school over in Benton City. And so I'm a real native around here.
Since you did have these kind of early experiences growing up here from a fairly early time, I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about what it was like going to school here at that time.
Oh, it was fun. That's what you make it, you know. And went to school in Benton City at Coyote Benton, and I remember back in about 1943 when they were starting to build the Hanford project. A friend of mine, a schoolmate, who had been displaced from Hanford, and he was going to school in Benton City also. And he says, you know, I've got what's an apple press, cider press. And he said, it's over where we used to live, over at Hanford. So he said, get your car, and he said, let's go get the cider press. So we did. And they let you in over there to do that then, because we knew, you know, it wasn't because we knew anybody. It was just the fact that at that point they didn't have it locked up, and you didn't have to have a badge to get in.
Do you have any memories then of Richland or White Bluffs or any of those communities?
Oh yeah. In fact, I played basketball in that school building in White Bluffs. It's just a shell of a building now, I think. But we played basketball there and rode the bus from Benton City to White Bluffs, and we played at Hanford because they had a separate high school. And it was all exciting for us. Remember stopping in at one of the stores and getting stuff, you know. We rode the bus out. And then earlier, had to be in the late 30s, they used to have boat races over at Hanford, just down in the river, and they were outboard boats, and the boats were the pumpkin seed type race boats. I remember going with my folks over to the races. That had to have been probably in the early 30s, because we went to the Horn Rapids, and then the road continued on out as it does now. But I think then it was a gravel road out to Hanford.
Do you have any particular memories of the boat races? We hear references to them a lot, and I very rarely meet someone who actually witnessed them.
Well, they were quite a few boats, and probably 15 or 20 boats at least. And they had the old outboard Evinrude type engines on them. And they'd go 60, 70 miles an hour. But it was exciting, especially for a 9-year-old.
I bet. And would they have sort of concessions and things down there?
Oh yeah, they had the usual stuff, hamburgers and so on.
That was a full day for you out
Oh
of
yeah,
the
it was
races.
a big day's trip.
I'm curious that we've heard a couple references to a circus actually coming to that area. Did you see that at all?
I never saw a circus out there. But I remember going to a circus when I was small with, and I think we went to Walla Walla to the circus. And that makes a big impression on a young mind.
So many questions. Where to go next? Could you talk a little bit about maybe where you lived, your parents' property, for example, your housing situation while you were growing up?
Well, we didn't have any housing problem because we lived on a farm. My dad had 70 acres, and he was on the Benton County PUD board, and he was on the board of the WPPSS, which is the now called Energy Northwest, and was instrumental in getting some of that stuff going.
So you had electricity then and that sort of thing in your house?
Well, the first house we lived in Benton City, we didn't have electricity. We had a telephone, but no electricity. And it was, we had a well. I remember one time my older brother Bob, was playing with had some soap, and he put it in the old cook stove in the little holes where you'd lift the lid off. And it was boiling in there, and he thought that was a great funny deal, but it caught fire. And the fire spread, and it was going up the curtains. My dad came running in, and he grabbed a bucket of water that we kept there for drinking, and threw it all over the fire and put it out. That was a little bit scary.
Lucky save for Dad.
Yeah.
So before I forget, do you have any particular memories of the store at White Bluffs? Like what sorts of things you'd stop there and purchase?
Well, no, I think it was a store and a service station, kind of like the convenience stores they have now, but it was, just a normal small grocery store. And that's about all I remember about that. But the bus would stop there, and the kids would go in and get pop and whatever.
Great. So I understand you started working at Hanford. Could you talk a little bit about when you started working at Hanford?
Well, I worked there, went to work out there, and actually in '48. I was in the Navy, and I got out of the Navy in 1946, and I worked a year, helped my dad on the ranch, and then I decided I would strike out and work at the big Hanford project, which was, exciting for young guys. And I worked there several years, and I worked there as a radiation timekeeper in the tank farms, and through 48, 9, and 50, and into 51 and 2. And my job was to keep track of how much time the workers spent in a hot zone. And I'd get the readings from the health instrument man and calculate how long they could spend at that job. Sometimes it was only 10 or 12 minutes before they got a full dose of the maximum radiation they were allowed. And at that time we were opening up the tops of the tanks, and they were going to install pump pits, and then they were also putting in pipe trenches and stainless pipe, large 8-10-inch diameter piping. And that idea at that time, as I understood it, was for reprocessing, which they eventually decided not to do under one of our presidents, decided not to do reprocessing. But that was in 1950, 51. And we had to use jackhammers to open up the top of the tank. and the workers with the jackhammers had to have jackhammer bits that were about 18 feet long, because that would let the operator of the jackhammer stay back away from the open pit, and he could work longer that way. Excuse me. And same way with when it jackhammer the concrete, and it fell down into the tanks, obviously. And then they had, of course, there was rebar in those too, so they had to put a cutting torch on the end of a long pole, probably between 15 and 18 feet long, so they could cut the rebar to open the tanks up. And in cutting the rebar, it would fall down in there too, so a lot of those chunks of concrete are probably still there. And that was 60-some years ago.
Did you have any other jobs at Hanford after that time?
Well, I worked for a while in the cannery where they canned uranium, and I was in the 300 area, just north, not too far from here, probably a half a mile from here. Excuse me. And that was entailed, they would bring the uranium in long rods, about an inch and a half in diameter, in boxcars, and then they would come into lathe operators operating the lathe, and they would turn down the outer part of the rod, and then they would cut them in certain lengths to be canned in aluminum cladding. And so we were working there at that job for a while. It was interesting, the uranium shavings from the lathe would fall down and they'd catch on fire, kind of like magnesium does. So they had to be kept putting out the fires of the burning uranium shavings.
And how long did you work there at 300?
Not very long. It was just a few weeks, I think. We had to wear all kinds of protective clothing, and it was so hot in there, they had an air conditioning tube coming down to each worker. So I didn't care for that.
And what did you do after that?
Pardon?
What did you do after that?
Well, I got into ironworking for a while, and I worked out there as an iron worker, and worked there about a year as an iron worker in the tank farm areas. And then I went down to McNary Dam and went to work down there for the final push on getting McNary Dam finished. And then in '53, I also worked on the missile bases out in the area and over on the Woluque Slope, across the river from Hanford. And it was the Nike missiles that we were installing at that time. And that was before I went to McNary, and then after that, then I bunched it all and went into the insurance business. So I was in the insurance business for the next 20 years or more, with various couple of companies. I was a division manager in Wenatchee for a number of years, and then I was with the superintendent of agencies for a company out of Salem, Oregon. And then after that, I went into the construction business in the 70s and had a construction company, built maybe 100 and some houses around here.
So So, of your time working at Hanford, could you describe kind of a typical day or anything that stands out?
Well, it depended on whether it was a cold day or a warm day. Some days we had a we had a shack that we stayed in when we weren't out actually on the job, and we would our downtime we'd have to spend in the shack because they didn't want you wandering around the project. So we would do that, and then we'd go out and work on do the work we were doing with. When I was working as a iron worker, I worked in the construction of the pipe trenches and so on, and the tanks. And if it was cold weather, we really hung around in the stove, and then we'd eat lunch in there also. And we had, when we went in there and left, we had a what they call, I think, a five-fold counter. You'd put your hands in and your feet, and it would count to see if you had any radiation or contamination of any kind. And once in a while, you'd have some, and they had a shower there where they'd have to shower people down if they had quite a bit of contamination. And I know there were several instances where they got quite a bit of them, and they had to work with them for a long time to get all the radiation and the contamination off.
Are there any ways that sort of the security or secrecy at Hanford impacted your work?
Well, we were always told, to keep our mouths shut, and of course we didn't know what they were building out there in the 40s anyway. But some people, they didn't have any idea. They said, well, there's so much sand out there, they're making sandpaper. And then another little kid said, well, he said, I think they're making toilet paper because my dad brings a couple rolls home every night. So nobody knew what they were making, so it was just they had to imagine what it might be.
How overall was Hanford as a place to work? Was there anything particularly rewarding or particularly
Well,
difficult?
it was rewarding in the fact that it was extremely interesting, and it was a huge job for the 50,000 workers back in the middle 40s. And while that was going on, I was in the Navy over in the Pacific somewhere, there in the Philippines and Okinawa and Shanghai, China, and so on.
I wonder if maybe you could talk just briefly about having had that experience of being part of the war and the war effort against Japan. How did you feel when you found out it was our plutonium from this area that built that bomb?
Well, everybody was extremely elated, to find out that our project out here had helped end the war, and because it was in the first atomic explosion in New Mexico, I guess it was, wasn't it? Yeah. And it was also the Nagasaki atomic bomb. But you couldn't help but feel some real distress over the fact of how many people it killed. And it was a very sobering thought. On the other hand, if we hadn't have used them, it would have probably cost 1 million lives of the Japanese and Americans, because they weren't going to give up. And that would have been a battle to the bitter end. So I was down in the South Pacific somewhere when they dropped the bombs, and so we were kind of thankful because we were going to be heading up there to try and finish it off. And the ship, you may remember hearing about it. It was the USS Indianapolis, a cruiser, and they had taken one of the atomic bombs to, was it Tinian, I think, and it was a secret journey, naturally, and they got torpedoed and sunk down. It wasn't probably about 500 miles from where we were in the South Pacific, and there was about, I think, 800 of them didn't survive, and they couldn't even get rescued because they were on a secret journey, and nobody knew where they were. Not many people, and it was pretty grim. And then we went from there. We went up to Okinawa, and we were up there for a while. And it was a pretty bad spot there. We had I went up. Most of the fighting was over. It was over then when I went up there, and I had a friend who was up in the mountains. I don't know what they were doing up there, but he was a corpsman in the Navy, but he was up there with some Marines, and they were living in tents up in the mountains, in the hills. And they would, sounds pretty gross, but they would go out every day, and the war was actually over. They'd go out every day and hunt Japs, and this guy, he told me, he says, just like hunting jackrabbits at home. It was pretty sobering also, because they were, the Japanese, a lot of them thought the war was still on, and they didn't know that it was over, and you couldn't blame them. They were trying to do their job. So that was really a sad situation. And then we were anchored out of a bay there, and there was a typhoon showed up. We put out to sea, and we were 3 days. The typhoon kept going just for 3 days. In the daytime, it was almost like nighttime, and there were a couple hundred small craft that didn't make it. Little minesweepers and things. But it was people talk about waves that are 100 feet high. They really are. And so then, but to get back to working out at Hanford, there were a lot of people. We had people that we let them put their trailers in our backyard because they didn't have any place to stay. They just had little camp trailers. And rather than stay in the big trailer court out at Hanford, they preferred to stay like in where we had shade trees and so on. And their kids went to school there. And then the two fellows that stayed in our backyard, their names were Bill and George Gale, and they'd come out from Kansas, and they came out to work at the Hanford Project, and they worked out there as machinists and welders, and then they saved their money, and not long after that initial construction, they opened up a car dealership, and then they eventually moved to Yakima and had a car dealership, and they had the white bus dealership, white trucks, that was the brand name, and they sold dozens and dozens of those buses to the Hanford Project. And So if anybody, your folks or anybody can remember working out there and riding the green buses, those were all came from their shop, Bill and George Gale.
How many people would you say camped out there at any one time?
At our backyard,
Mm-hmm.
there them and they had families. The two of them, their wives and children, and then one of them's father and his wife and a younger sister of them lived out there also. And we enjoyed having them. I was in high school at that time, before I left to go to the Navy. And they were good mechanics, so they helped me keep my car running. And I had a Ford Roadster
Nice.
back then. In fact, I still have a Ford Roadster. I belong to the old car club of the Tri-Cities, and I have 4 old cars.
Wonderful.
A 32 Ford Roadster and a 1931 Model A Coupe. They both have rumble seats. And then a 63 Thunderbird Landau and a 1954 Kaiser Manhattan. And
We've heard a couple stories of people going out and actually finding cars on the Hanford site. Did you ever?
yeah, back then they'd find cars out there that people had left, and of course now they'd be a treasure trove. But there were a lot of cars out there that people just abandoned when they got kicked off their property, evicted. That was a tough deal for a lot of people. Some of them spend their whole lives out there, and they had farms and orchards and families, and of course the schools. And they were just plain evicted, and they didn't have much time. So a lot of them moved to Richland and Benton City and Kennewick and Pasco. And it was an exciting time, and it was a sad time at the same time. But it was pretty exciting for a guy that was 15, 16 years old.
Yeah, I wonder if you could maybe just talk a little bit about some of the changes when people started pouring into this area to start building this site.
Oh, it was pretty grim at times, because you had so many people coming in, and they were out in the men's barracks and so on, and they'd have murders. And I remember my mother was on the federal jury in Yakima on a couple of murder cases. You get that many men in one spot, some of them aren't going to get along. And a lot of gambling and throwing the dice and card games, and it was like a den of iniquity.
Now, did you ever come to Richland as maybe a teenager and witness any of these changes?
Well, over 2 or 3, 4 years, you can remember the construction and the building of the houses and all the alphabet houses and the prefabs. Of course, all the prefabs were built without foundations, and there was a lot of work in later years of contractors putting in foundations on the prefabs that hadn't had any. And the prefabs were heated with the portable 220 volt heater, about 2,000 or 2,500 watts. In fact, I have one in my shop from way back in the 40s, and it still works. The 220 volt heater, and you could buy them, but I doubt if you could find them nowadays. And a lot of people would, we had the movie theater out here at Hanford here, not far from where we're at right now. In fact, it was just up the road here, south of here. And they had gigantic mess halls. And I worked out there as a teamster for a while too, as a truck driver and swamper. So he worked in a warehouse, and we had plenty of off time. We'd throw dice. It was always fun to gamble a little bit. We couldn't go to Toppenish to the Legends Casino then. So anyhow.
Is there anything else that stands out to you about sort of community life in Richland during that?
The what? Pardon?
Is there anything else that stands out about sort of community events or community life in Richland?
Yeah, they used to have a Richland celebration that was, I forget what it was called, Frontier Days or something, I believe.
Atomic Frontier Days?
Yeah. And we'd come down and watch the parade, and it was interesting, very interesting and a lot of fun. And we'd also, up where the Lutheran church is on the corner of Van Giesen and what is that other street that runs north and south? Anyhow, it's where the Lutheran church is now. There used to be a Grange building. It was an old wooden building, and they held Grange meetings there. And we used to go there, and they'd have dances in that old building. I don't believe it was a church at that time. And the road came, the Van Giesen was how you came from Benton City to get into Richland. And you'd turn right there and go down that street, and it was all alfalfa fields around here then. So that building was out in the middle of nowhere, in the corner of Van Giesen, and we'd have, they had fairs, and like people would bring their canned goods and have it judged. And I had, my dad's two older brothers were bachelors, and John and Charlie Johanson, and they lived in Benton City. And those two old bachelors, they'd can stuff and beautiful products that they'd put out. And they'd go down and win prizes and ribbons at the fair, little fair they'd have there at that, the old dance hall. That was, and that was part of, that was before, that was probably before Hanford, but then as it spread out and started building houses for the project, then all those alfalfa fields became developments. And I've had a lot of friends that lived in alphabet houses, and they were well built buildings. They're still standing, and a lot of them are, overhauled and remodeled. But there's still a lot of fine houses that are still here from the old days.
Yeah. So was there a fairly substantial influx of students to your school then when?
Yeah, they, back in, before Hanford, we used to, the Benton City School used to play Richland because they were in the same league then, because Richland was only about 300 people. And they had the families, I remember some of their names, the Van Dynes, they had a big family, and they played, we used to play them in basketball and against the Van Dyne brothers. And there were several others, I can't remember their names now, but they were, a lot of good athletes came out of Richland even during that time. And as they got bigger and bigger, larger, Richland High became a real force in the sports competition.
Let's see, so JFK visited Hanford in 1963. Were you around for that?
In '63, no, I was actually living in, that's when I lived in Wenatchee for 10, I was division manager for Prudential Insurance Company up there.
Okay. So you worked at Hanford until the what, 1954? Do I have that correct?
I worked until 1953,
53.
and but it was a lot of places now that were places I remembered then were like the corner of by where the post office is now, and across the street there's some offices on the west side of Jadwin, and that used to be a big drugstore, and a lot of people would just hang out there because they had a soda fountain, and it was an interesting place to be. Meet all the young folks around there. And
I imagine it must have been exciting meeting people from all different places.
it was, because you'd meet people from all over the United States. 'Cause people would come up from the South, the Midwest, as far as Florida, and it would really broaden your scope a lot more than being just raised in a little dinky town, and then meet all the people from the big cities in the eastern part of the United States, and they were different, the same but different, you know. And when Bill and George Gale, they got to our place and parked their trailers under the trees, their dad was going to come out, and of course, they had accents from Kansas. To us, they had an accent. And George, he talked to his dad, and we had an old telephone that was on the wall, you know, you had to crank it. He talked to his dad back in Kansas, and he said, he says, Dad, he said, if you have tar trouble, wire us. If you have tire trouble, wire us. And that was the way they talked. So to us, it was humorous, but that's, you know, that's the way they were.
You might have sounded a little funny to them, too.
Wonderful people, too. Wonderful people.
Now, how did that come about, that they came to camp on your property?
Well, they couldn't. They didn't want to stay out in a huge trailer camp out at Hanford, and they'd rather drive back and forth and have their kids go to the school, local school, and then it was kind of a paradise compared to some places, with great big shade trees, and the trailers were in the shade, and it was good, you know, a lot better place than being out in the desert.
So they just happened to run into your dad somewhere and make.
I don't know. I think what they did was they were traveling around, scouting around, and they saw our place, and and there weren't many places to stay at all, so they were extremely happy to find a place in order to park there, and they were there about 2 years, I think.
Would they pay your dad some sort of rent, or?
It was he charged them some rent, but it was really low, like $15 a month or something like that. Of course, wages weren't that high then either, because they were about they were under $2 an hour at that time. And so I did a stint of, when I was ironworking, we went up to Cooley Dam, and I worked up there for a while, and started out at $1.85 an hour and doing hard work. So you get to, now the minimum wage is going over $10 an hour. We'd have thought we'd died and gone to heaven if we could get $6 an hour.
Right. So were wages at Hanford comparatively better to what you?
Oh, they were better then, because there on the farm, you know, we'd hire people to pick potatoes, you know, in sacks, and they'd get maybe like 2 or 3 cents a sack for picking them, and they'd make, if they were good, they'd make $2 or $3 a day, and the wages were like 25 cents an hour back in the 30s, and up into the time the project started, and then all the wages started going up, where you could make, you know, you could make $75 a week. Even as an iron worker, I'd make about $75 a week, and then working on down McNary Dam, I was a foreman down there, and I got $2.25 an hour, so I really cashing in.
So I wonder, most of my students do not remember the Cold War. This is a foreign time period to them.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts that you think it's important for the next generation to know about what America's role was during that time?
Well, the main role was keeping the peace and balancing the competition with Russia, and it wasn't just Russia then. It was their whole group of countries that are separate countries now, as we know about with the Ukraine and so on that's going on right now. And but it was pretty scary at times. I remember there was a time when everybody was putting in bomb shelters, and they were teaching kids to duck and cover in the schools. Get next to a concrete wall and cover your head, as if that would have done any good, But we didn't have much other choice. So, and a lot of people did put in bomb shelters, but I think in the end, it was not backing down. And the presidents, and I think all of our presidents have been outstanding, not just one or two, but from Roosevelt on up, through the start of World War II. And people like Harry Truman, it took a lot of guts to order them to drop the bombs on those poor people over there in Japan. And then continuing on, and they were all good presidents, I think, and they all played a role, whether they were Republicans or Democrats. They were all. You got to be good to get to be president. You have to have something on the ball. I won't get into any politics.
You can if you want to. I'm curious if you could talk for just a moment. It's kind of a side note to working at Hanford, but do you recall where you were when Pearl Harbor was bombed?
Yeah. I was. It was in school time. The school wasn't out, and the next day we had an assembly. They had an assembly in the large auditorium at the school there in Benton City, and they had the radio on, and we were listening to President Roosevelt with his famous speech, and that was really, the kids were scared. Everybody was scared that they were going to be coming over here bombing us too, and they probably could have, and they probably would have, except for the Japanese admiral that warned them not to. He says, because if you get over there and try to invade the United States, he said, there'll be a gun behind every blade of grass. So he says, don't do it. That was probably a slight exaggeration, but he got his point across. There was probably a gun behind every 2 blades of grass. Every blade of asparagus.
Is there anything? That's the end of my questions. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about? Any other stories that stand out to you?
Oh, I remember when a story about when they completed the N reactor. It was a dual-purpose reactor, produced uranium for the war effort, for the military, and also electricity. And I have a program from when President Kennedy came out and gave a speech and turned on the reactor. And I'll find it here. And I would like to, if you guys would like to have it for your work,
We'd love to.
I'd like to donate it.
Oh, really?
It shows President Kennedy on the front, and he let's see, all the official program and the story behind it. The atomic wand that he used, the atomic wand that shows him using the wand to start the reactor, and pictures of notables there, and pictures up here. My dad was a